WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, flying solo this week, but Tia, she's back on Monday. Looking forward to that, and looking forward to this episode with you, where today on the program, we'll celebrate Mother's Day weekend by hearing from moms and you about your experiences with motherhood. But first on the Metro, America purports itself to be a democracy, and so we have representatives to carry forth our priorities on our behalf. We want better roads, and so a majority of us vote in someone who will give us better roads. We want more houses, so more of us vote in someone who gives us housing. But how should Americans preserve the will of the majority without trampling over the rights of the minority? In today's America, journalist Ari Berman argues that we've gotten that problem backwards. In his new book, Minority Rule, the author says our political structures, particularly those of the Electoral College and the Senate, do too much to protect a small portion of the country while trampling over the desires of the majority. But Ari also argues in a New York Times article that Michigan has found a way to undo this problem. So what is the issue of minority rule, and how was Michigan able to resolve it? To discuss this now, we have Ari Berman with us. Ari, welcome to the Metro.
Hey, Nick. So great to talk to you. Thank you.
Happy to have you here also. And let's just start from the basics. What is minority rule?
Well, minority rule, as I define it, is the effort of an elite conservative white minority to entrench and hold on to power by preventing a diverse new American majority from taking power. And I look at that problem in the present day, but I also trace it all the way back to the founding fathers and show how it started.
All right. Well, let's get into the history then. How did we get to this point today, as you argue, where we have such a small number of people who are exercising their rights or their positions over the majority?
Well, the founding fathers were really concerned with protecting a very particular minority, which was themselves.
Yeah.
They wanted to protect the rights of white male property owners, and many of whom were slaveholders. So when we think of minorities, we tend to think of previously disenfranchised communities, right? African Americans, women, other historically marginalized groups. The founding fathers weren't concerned with those minority groups so much, but they realized that they themselves were a distinct minority that needed to be protected from the masses. So they wanted to create a representative government that did represent the people, but more importantly, protected the interests of themselves. And so there was a lot of self-interest that went into the Constitution itself and to the structures that were created. And it's this contradiction that America's most important democratic document was actually intended in many ways to make the country less democratic.
So that's interesting to hear from you, because you said they're all interested in protecting their own their own interest. And before I get into a little bit of how I want to tease this out, can you tell us the specific mechanisms that they put in place that they did to do this and how they operate?
Well, the government that was laid out in the Constitution really prevented the people from having a say in most branches of the government. Only one house of the government was actually directly elected by the people, the House of Representatives. So senators were appointed they were nominated by state legislatures and then appointed by the lower house. The president was not directly elected by the people. There was a complicated system of electors that exists in modified form today. The Supreme Court was a product of senators who are not elected by the people and presidents who are not elected by the people. And so in many ways, the people were prevented from having any say in the mechanisms of running the country. And then not only that, but in many states, voting was restricted to white male property owners. So in the first presidential election, for example, only 6% of Americans were actually eligible to vote, and a much smaller portion actually voted.
Well, then how do we get these terms that we always hear about from folks like a government for the people, by the people? Is this just marketing spin that was a lie from the beginning and they knew it? Or where does this conflict come into play?
Well, there was this tension among the founders because they laid out this very utopian rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence that government exists to benefit what they call the consent of the governed, that all men are created equal. So they had this very utopian rhetoric. And for a brief period of time after 1776, there were these state constitutions that were drafted in these state governments that were very democratic. But the founders started worrying about this because an economic crisis hit in the 1780s. It felt like states were passing populist policies that were favoring the poor over the rich. The central government didn't have a lot of power in the Articles of Confederation. So the founding fathers believed in democracy, but they worried that too much democracy could be a bad thing. And they really committed to the ideas of majority rule in the Declaration of Independence. Then they started worrying that majority rule could trample the rights of the minorities, particularly the minority that we talked about earlier, which was white male property owners.
Yeah.
They were concerned with that. And so they were trying to balance these things. They were trying to figure out, how do we have a democracy but not too much democracy? How do we facilitate majority rule but protect the rights of ourselves, this distinct elite white minority? And so those are conflicts that existed in the present day that in many ways are still ongoing today.
Yeah, well, then let's get into those conflicts that are persisting in the present day. How do we get from that place to what you're seeing now? And can you describe the problem for folks?
Well, the problem is that we have these historically undemocratic institutions, and some of them have been reformed, but a lot of them haven't been reformed. We still have a situation where the Electoral College still exists, so someone can lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College, or we still have a U.S. Senate in which each state has the same number of representatives, so small, whiter, more conservative rural states have way more representation in the Senate than larger, more urban, more diverse states. And then layered on top of that is this newer anti-democratic movement that has a lot of influence in the Republican Party, that has been committed to tactics like voter suppression, gerrymandering, dark money, the stacking of the courts, the whitewashing of history. So what I argue is that there's both these historically undemocratic institutions, but layered on top of that is this newer anti-democratic movement, and that's a very volatile thing when you combine both of those aspects.
I think it's interesting hearing you tease this out from that history, which, again, you mentioned is so important, to where we're at right now, because I would think the conventional wisdom would be that what the Constitution set up was to make sure that smaller states weren't trampled over by larger states. But what I'm hearing from you is that wasn't really even the paradigm at all. The paradigm, again, was for the rich and which is fewer in number, to be able to retain power regardless. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, so they had to make a lot of compromises to ratify the Constitution. And one of the compromises they made was giving each state in the U.S. Senate the same level of representation. But the founding fathers, many of them were actually very unhappy about this idea. So James Madison, who is in many ways the architect of the Constitution, he basically wants the Senate to be based on proportional representation because he wants to maintain the legitimacy of the body by having it represent the greatest number of people. But what happens is the smaller states essentially rebel, and they say, if you don't give us the same level of representation, we're going to leave the Union, which is about the most radical thing you can say in 1787 after they've just fought a war with England, that you might join England or you might join France. And so basically the small states hold a gun to the head of the larger states to get them to agree to their demands to the Senate to then ratify the Constitution. The slave states do the same with the House through the 3/5 clause, which basically gives Southern states much more representation because their enslaved population, which is disenfranchised and has no rights, are still considered 3/5 of a person for purpose of representation. So that means that both the small states have more representation in the Senate, the slave states have more representation in the House because the Electoral College is based on representation in both houses. That means that those distinct minorities, the slave states and the small states, have more power in the Electoral College. Now, many of the founders were uncomfortable with these ideas, but in the spirit of compromise, they had to ratify them. So I think it's important to note that a lot of the Constitution was a product of horse trading and concessions, and actually a lot of the most prominent founders were unhappy with the institutions that they created in some respects.
We're speaking again right now with Ari Berman, national voting rights correspondent at Mother Jones and author of the new book, Minority Rule. And we're going to get into a little bit of Michigan, specifically how that informs what Ari's ideas are. We're also going to get into potentially solutions and also concerns some might have about the prospect of majority rule. All that comes up and more when we continue on the Metro in just a moment. It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, hanging out with you and talking right now with Ari Berman, national voting rights correspondent at Mother Jones, who recently authored a new book, Minority Rule. And we're getting into the issues of minority rule we're facing right now in the country, as Ari set forth, where those who have less of the population have more of the power and get to enact their rules on all of us. And Ari, one of the reasons I bring this kind of up and frame this way is we've talked a lot about the history, and you even brought up how this impacted things like slavery, things like segregation, things like the subjugation of African Americans. But I think folks in that, if we were having that conversation here, I know as someone who's a minority also, there's always this concern that when the majority has power, they will use it to oppress specifically minorities like myself. So when we hear about this idea that you get rid of these protections that allow the minority to put something forth, some might say, hey, wait a second, we needed that in order to prevent harms that we were facing. What would you say to those folks?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, that the protection of minority rights is of paramount importance in a democracy. And we see lots of authoritarian regimes that oppress minority rights, and minority rights have been oppressed historically in the United States. But I'm saying it's the inverse problem that we have right now. Both historically, the founding fathers, as I mentioned, wanted to protect the rights of an elite white minority, not historically disenfranchised minorities. And right now, we have this elite conservative white minority that essentially is trying to hold on to power by disenfranchising the rights of broader minority groups more generally. So I'm saying that it's different. It's not the historically disenfranchised communities are not the ones ruling right now. The historically privileged communities are the ones that essentially are instituting minority rule. And so I think that in many ways goes against the idea that democracy should be based on the consent of the governed. Yeah,
and let me jump in on that too, because that's a good point. But I think what I'm also thinking about right now is that we're in a moment in time. For example, you mentioned that in rural areas that are less populated, they have more political power. But that, one could argue, is just perchance where we ended up right now. There's nothing that necessarily says certain people have to group in a certain way. You can move wherever you want. We just happen to end up in this place where, because of people moving populations, urban centers getting denser, or whatever it is, this is how we ended up with this perspective. So I guess the concern would be, well, hey, how can we set up a system? How would you recommend we set up a system that prevents oppression of the minority that could be oppressed while does not favor a minority that has more political or power or has more money and all of these items?
Well, first, I would argue that some of it is by design. The U.S. Senate, by giving each state 2 senators, was essentially guaranteeing that there would be minority rule and that smaller states would have more representation than larger states. So, I mean, like, some of that is not just a product of geographic grouping, but it's built into the Constitution in terms of how it's structured. And then what I would argue is that we need specific protections for minority rights. So we have a lot of those protections, things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act, and lots of those efforts were intended to both protect the rights of the minority, but also were things that were supported by the majority. And also were passed through the channels of majority rule in terms of going through the Congress and being signed by presidents and that sort of thing. And now my worry is that the institutions have been so captured that we have presidents who lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. We have senators who hold a majority of power despite representing a minority of Americans. We have a Supreme Court in which a majority of justices were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote and who were confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. So far from protecting, I think, minority rights as we tend to think of them, it seems like a reactionary minority has captured so much of the government despite not having actually a majority of support.
I think polling would support what you're saying, and we are seeing that issue at the federal level, which is one of the reasons why you penned an article for the New York Times highlighting the need to maybe focus more on the states and celebrating Michigan for our efforts here. We know that even though more of our voters for a good decade there happen to be more Democratic because of gerrymandering, we were losing a lot in the state house, state senate, but we were able to fix that. What can you point to that Michigan was able to do? Why do you see this as a beacon or maybe a model that other states could follow?
Well, give yourself a pat on the back, because I think Michigan is one of the success stories for democracy right now. And the fascinating thing is that activists and organizers used direct democracy to expand democracy. First, in 2018, they passed a ballot initiative to end partisan gerrymandering. They passed ballot initiatives to dramatically expand voting rights through policies like automatic and election day registration, no excuse absentee voting. That was followed up 4 years later with more pro-democracy policies, early voting, drop boxes, combating election subversion. I think Michigan's an example of how a state can move from minority rule to majority rule, and how you can change a situation where the government does not represent a majority of people to a majority of people having their voices heard. And the fascinating thing about direct democracy in Michigan is that when you took things out of a Democratic versus Republican context and you just asked everyday voters, do you want to ban gerrymandering? Do you want to make it more convenient and easier to vote? Huge majorities of people said yes, not 50+1, but 60 to 70% of voters were in favor of these things. And that makes me think that democracy is much less contentious of an issue when you put it directly before the people, as opposed to always putting it through the political parties or through candidates themselves. And I think that's a model that other states can build on as well.
You know, I hear what you're saying there, and I think that's right. But I also remember that vote, and that went to the Michigan Supreme Court, which upheld it for gerrymandering specifically. I'm talking about the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission that makes our districts now. That was a 4-3 Supreme Court vote, and it took a Republican or someone who was nominated by a Republican or put up by the Republicans to actually vote in favor of it. So you could argue we here in this state were one Supreme Court voter away from this not working. I bring all of that up not only to show how tenuous any of this change can be in a moment, but also to think when you have these kind of structures in place, what do we need to do in this state and other states? What would you recommend we do to even get past those kind of concerns? Because it seems like this is a heavy lift.
Well, sometimes it only takes one vote to make things possible.
Right.
But I mean, it is instructive, though, that once it got out of those political mechanisms and it went directly before the voters, this was something that was overwhelmingly popular before the voters, and also passed a lot of red Republican counties that supported Donald Trump. And so even a lot of Trump voters were responsive to things like making it easier to vote and banning gerrymandering. What I think it puts a focus on is the importance of electing pro-democracy candidates more broadly. And I don't mean electing Democrats. This is a really important distinction. This means electing pro-democracy candidates. And that can mean electing Republicans. It can mean electing independents. It can be electing Democrats. I mean, the Independent Redistricting Commission that was created had a majority of independents. And then it had Democrats and Republicans who signed up on those maps. And the maps they passed weren't perfect. There's litigation in Detroit right now over how some of the districts were drawn in violation of the Voting Rights Act. But I think it was an attempt to try to take politics out of the redistricting process and to take self-interest out of the redistricting process. Because if you go to a job interview, you don't hire yourself for a job, right, Nick? I mean, we all wish we could.
Oh,
right?
I wish I could, but that's true.
That's essentially what happens every 2 or 4 years when politicians draw these districts. And it's just, I think, that makes common sense that an independent entity would do it. And the interesting thing is Michigan's now much more in line with how the rest of advanced industrial democracies do these things, which is nonpartisan entities tend to run elections, set voting districts, do these kind of things. They take the politics out of it. In America, it's lots of self-interest governing this process. And so I think Michigan is an example of how democracy can be expanded, how people themselves can expand democracy, and also the fact that democracy reforms more broadly are, generally speaking, pretty popular.
Yeah, pat yourself on the back, Michigan. According to Ari Berman, you are a model. We are a model for preserving democracy here in the country. Ari Berman, journalist and author of the new book, Minority Rule. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Great to talk to you. Thanks a lot, Nick.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, and as I mentioned to you, Mother's Day is this Sunday. We will be celebrating it with you right here today on the show. We're going to have some moms coming up and take your calls a little bit later. The phone number here is 313-577-1019. But while the holiday has been around for a long time now, the role as mother has changed for some. That became particularly true because of the COVID-19 pandemic. On a recent episode of Created Equal, host Stephen Henderson spoke with Wayne State professor Catherine McGuire about how motherhood has changed. They began this conversation by discussing how the pandemic impacted parents.
We were kind of looking at what did COVID-19 do for dual income couples? How did that change things, particularly when you had such, just like you said, disruption, when work is in the house? And how did that affect particularly parents? And even though we're in the middle of analysis, it was difficult for parents in particular. Particularly those who have neurodivergent kids as well. So, parents became like, when the schools shut down, their kids, they had to help with the education. But then you have that overlay of those who had IEPs and those who had, plans, and the parent had to somehow figure that out as well. So it was a significant challenge, to say the least.
Yeah. And it's a challenge that didn't go away necessarily when the world went back to normal, or whatever normal, I guess, means right now. Certainly, we're not doing the things that we were doing during COVID, but life does still look different.
Yeah, and I think there were gifts from COVID, too. One of the things that we found in our interview data is that we asked kind of like, how do you think about COVID? Like, if you had a metaphor or a figure of speech to describe your COVID experience, what would it be? And so many, in the second time we talked to them, really started focusing on the benefits. And it was that quality time, like that spending time together. It wasn't the gifts. It wasn't all that. It was, being able to take those walks and find fun ways to connect. And I think that's the gift of COVID that we hope will pay forward, is recognizing that time together, even though it was stressful and it was difficult, and managing so many different roles and hats, you got to spend time with each other in a way that you hadn't really before.
Yeah. So what are the changes that seem to have, I guess, stuck from the pandemic and the difference in parenting, and which ones are kind of behind us now?
Well, I think social media, was talked about earlier, is a theme from both the parents and the kids' perspective. One of the things I was thinking about is like, where did I learn about parenting the most? Mm-hmm. And even though I had this PhD, I'm like, oh, I have all this research. I study family communication. I got this. I didn't, right?
You never quite do.
You
until
never
you
do.
Actually are a parent, right?
And so the greatest teacher for me on being a parent was actually my kid. And letting go of these expectations. And I think that's one thing that COVID did for us, is force us to let go of a lot of expectations. This is how things should be. This is what I should be doing, what I need to be doing. But unfortunately, as we're emerging and workplaces are readjusting, we're beginning now hearing about, flexible work arrangements. Maybe we don't need those anymore. Maybe you need to come back to the office. And that need to is coming back in on some of the things that seem to actually be working.
Yeah. It seems like some of what we learned during the pandemic was about how flexible and how resilient our kids can be. And I don't want to overstate that, because I think there are certainly things about the pandemic that did great
Absolutely. So much change. It was an interventional moment. I mean, everything that we thought, all the things that we had come to expect and want in life just stopped. Parents expected other people to care for their kids, and for a lot of them, that now became everyone's responsibility in the home. It really started people thinking about how, as an individualistic culture, like, you are you and you're on your own and you have to take care of your family, like this intense motherhood, right? You have to do it all. You have to sacrifice yourself for the good of your kids. And then we had this pandemic, and that just disrupted everything. So the question is, as we continue emerging, how can we as parents learn from the resilience of our kids and see that and give some of those lessons back to us?
That was Wayne State professor Catherine McGuire speaking with Created Equal host Stephen Henderson. You can find episodes of Created Equal on WDET.org or wherever you find your podcasts. And this is the Metro on 1019 WDET. And coming up, we'll discuss the strange traits that siblings sometimes share. It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, and are you close to your sibling? Do you share unusual traits with them? Is it something that you've noticed or that people have told you? Well, it turns out that a lot of siblings are similar, and in sometimes some very strange ways. In this recent report, The Science of Siblings, NPR's Ari Daniel investigated why brothers and sisters share unusual characteristics.
It was New Year's Day, and Emma Trenchard was on holiday in Cape Town, South Africa. She was visiting her older brother and his family. They were out to lunch at a cafe.
We were just waiting for our food, and we'd given my niece a colouring book to keep her quiet, which didn't really work that well.
As in, the little 2-year-old proceeded to throw her crayons under the table, so Trenchard slipped off her shoes and started picking them up with her feet.
I mean, if you've got bare feet, it makes more sense to pick it up with your foot than it does to sort of crawl under the table and pick it up with your hands.
Trenchard's always had unusually dexterous feet. As an artist, she's even used them for drawing portraits.
I broke my thumb and I just drew with my feet all the time.
So at the cafe in Cape Town, Trenchard was quite comfortable grabbing the crayons with her feet. And then she noticed her older brother Tommy, he was doing the exact same thing.
I was quite surprised because Tommy said, "Look, I'll show you how it's done." So it became a sort of toe battle. Until we realized we both had our bare, knobbly feet out, putting things on the table, and everyone was trying to eat their lunch.
Judging from people's reactions, this was not normal behavior.
This is Tommy, Emma's big brother.
I suppose I haven't really found many things I can't pick up with my toes.
And I should mention that neither their mom nor dad can do this fancy footwork. It's just Emma and Tommy, which makes it all the more special and revealing. Nancy L. Siegel is a psychologist at California State University, Fullerton. She spent her career studying not just siblings, but twins in particular. She's trying to understand the origins of certain behaviors and physical traits because she wants to know how we become who we are as individuals. When I told her about Emma and Tommy, and what they can do with their feet, she was impressed.
I find that rather extraordinary because I don't think that picking up things with your feet with that kind of dexterity is that common.
Siegel says it's likely that both Emma and Tommy just happened to inherit a similar set of genes that gave them that ability. Sharing such a quirky trait isn't that common for most siblings, but there's one category who shares oodles of these oddities: identical twins. Siegel's focused her research on pairs who were raised apart and then later reunited, and she's found that identical twins raised separately have more of these shared quirks than fraternal twins raised together.
We had twins who read books from back to front. A pair of Scottish ladies, and they would eat toast. They'd cut it into 4 pieces and always leave the last one. That's just how they did things.
Siegel connected me with a pair of identical twins who just turned 72. Sharon Posette and Debbie Melman were separated at birth when they were adopted by different families. Growing up, Posette says she always felt like something was missing.
Yeah, I was always lonely. Always.
And for years, Melman felt the same way. She wanted someone her age to go on vacation with, have sleepovers with.
I always wished there was somebody out there.
Then, when she was 45, Melman found out from her adopted mother that there had been 2 babies. She hired a private investigator, and before she knew it, she was speaking with her twin sister on the phone. The 2 agreed to meet, so Posette flew up to Connecticut, where Melman was waiting for her at the airport. Here's Posette.
It was just the most amazing connection.
On the one hand, they were strangers, but they were clearly cut from the same cloth.
We had decided we had the same lipstick on. We always run late. We listen to classical music. We drink tea about 5 times a day, hot tea. We both noticed that we're like rolling our eyes and it's like this kind of a thing.
Melman demonstrates. She crosses her eyes and then rolls them.
We've both done that since, we were little. Like, if something is really stupid, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe it.
But there were these other deeper currents of similarity. They were both social workers. They're both religious. Posette's Christian, Melman's Jewish. And both say they find a profound comfort in the things they share. And that overlap doesn't make them feel any less unique.
It's more of a compliment that somebody else does it too, that you admire and love.
Posette and Melman are like dozens of pairs of identical twins who psychologist Nancy L. Siegel has studied over the years. Her research, she says, leads to a clear message.
Many of our behaviors that we think we just acquired by random chance are not a matter of random chance.
Siegel says the environment plays a role, but she thinks it's our genes that are often behind what makes each of us an individual, quirks and all. Identical twins are more likely than other pairs of siblings to share genes and therefore traits. But every now and again, you do get a pair of siblings who aren't identical twins, but do inherit the same random combo of genes, and out pops the same shared quirk.
It's nice to know that you share so much.
Like Emma and Tommy Trenchard, who can pick most everything up with their toes, including crayons during those under-the-table competitions.
And just to clarify, I definitely did win the battle.
So even amongst these shared sibling idiosyncrasies, it can still be survival of the fittest.
That is the Metro here on 101.9 WDET, as we just heard a very interesting conversation about the commonalities of siblings, courtesy of NPR's Ari Daniel. And on the Metro, as we continue right now, we're going to get into a conversation about Mother's Day in celebration of Mother's Day with you as well. If you want to get involved with the conversation, 313-577-1019. Again, 313-577-1019, and then we can work you into the conversation as well. But right now, like I mentioned, this weekend is Mother's Day, and we're celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our lives on this show, as we did almost a century ago with the beginnings. Actually, over a century ago, with the beginnings of Anna Jarvis's tribute to her own mother. It eventually blossomed into a national day of recognition thanks to President Woodrow Wilson's proclamation in 1914. And today we continue that tradition by hearing from stories from some of the moms that make not only this station, but Southeast Michigan move. To start off, we're joined by one of the people behind the scenes here at WDET that you don't always get to hear from, but someone who makes us go. Diane Sanders, Manager of Strategic Initiatives at the station. She has 4 daughters that are 8 years apart, between ages 27 and 19. Diane, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Carrie Budzinski, who's a mother to 2 kids, a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. She lives in Livonia and is a city council member there. Councilmember Budzinski, thanks for joining us on the Metro.
Happy to be here.
Also joined by one of the icons here in the Detroit artistic scene, Sabrina Nelson, who's a mother to 3 kids, all adults now, 41, 36, and 23. But she's also a grandmother to a 10 and 8-year-old living here in Detroit. Sabrina, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you.
So I'm so glad to have this panel of you guys here because I don't know if you know this, but I've never been a mother.
Wow, shocking.
I know. So
I figured that out.
I don't know much about it. I need to get this insight. And since we want to find out not only what the experience is like for all of you, but also maybe a little bit of how it changed. Can you tell us, Sabrina, to start out for you, when was that moment that you realized, oh my gosh, I am a mother? And what was that like for you?
Labor.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Labor that continues after labor, when you birth a child, when you grow a whole being in your belly and you understand what the word agape means, which is self-emptying love, that you would do anything to protect and provide for that child beyond romantic eros love, which is, I love you because you cute, or I love you because you do nice things for me.
Yeah.
But agape love, eventually when you're holding that newborn in your arms and you realize that your body is magical and that you grew this whole being in your body, and then they come out and you look at them and you see yourself, and sometimes you see the combination of who helped make that child, but you realize that you hold the sustenance in your breast and you hold the care for that baby in your arms, and you would do anything to protect them because they cannot do it at that moment. Then you learn what being a mother truly is, and then you sit there in awe of your own mother and you're like, she did this how many times? That's crazy.
Oh, my gosh. I can only imagine. You had 3. Diane has you beat by 1 additional.
Yep.
4, Diane.
Yep.
What's the experience like growing up in or raising a household of 4 daughters like you did?
Well, it's interesting, to say the least. I did come from a large family of 9, so I was kind of used to a large household. But having 4 daughters is, I call it a love-hate relationship. I love them to death. Now, they do get on my nerves sometimes, but I love them to death, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. They are amazing, and to see them become what I created is amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
You know, motherhood is something that links all 3 of you here, and I think it links us back to the history, right? Anybody who's coming up, you've always had a mother. Mm-hmm. I'm sure these experiences have been same through the generations, which is one of the reasons I want to bring you in, Carrie, as one of the newest moms here. When you're hearing these voices, what does it make you think of?
It really reminds me of the fact that you don't understand motherhood until you've been in it. Mm-hmm. You know, to my question of like, when did you feel like a mom? It's honestly when I had my second. And I mean, I adore my oldest, and he's my dreamboat. That's what I call him. But he was like our roommate. You know, your first kid, I jokingly say anyone can have 1 kid because, you know, it's kind of, you can do it and you can kind of balance things and you don't lose all of your identity necessarily all at once. But when you have your second child, you learn that perhaps you aren't the best parent that you thought you were. And they teach you so much more about yourself. My youngest taught me that everyone is born their own person. And that was really enlightening, and learning how to love people differently, how to respond to people's needs differently, how to, you know, a reflection on myself, all the things that he broke his leg, he fell down the stairs and lost his front tooth, all these things that I thought were like important or really too hard to handle. He showed me that they aren't too hard to handle and you can do that. And so I think that's the beauty of motherhood, and what my kids have really taught me.
Yeah, you know, I I love hearing about that also because it reminds me of a conversation that we had actually here at the station, because we were also asking not only you, Diane, but some of the other moms that make this station work about their experiences. It can change through different communities and cultures. One person we spoke with the WDET news reporter Nargis Rahman, who provided insights as well.
In Bangladeshi homes, the oldest daughter is the second mother to the siblings. So in terms of taking care of them, feeding them, helping them with homework, helping them navigate through life, that fell on me since as long as I could remember, probably since the age of 9. But I actually became a mother myself just 1 month shy of my 22nd birthday. And I can tell you that I was not prepared. It's definitely not the same thing as taking care of siblings. I thought I could handle it, but it was a lot harder than I expected. From things like learning how to manage other people's schedules to navigating how to become a working parent. But I do love every moment of it.
I think one of the things that's interesting about that is, again, this changing definition of motherhood also and what it means to be a mom when we experience it. And for you, Sabrina, not only have you had a chance to be a mom now, you've also got grandchildren.
I do.
So,
I do.
So can you explain for us, especially for some who need to hear a little bit more, did that change your insight or ideas as to motherhood once you became a grandmother?
Absolutely. My oldest is 41. Denise has been married now for 20 years. And I will say first, I want to back up a little bit and define motherhood. The idea of motherhood for me is birthing children, but also helping to raise children from others. Like I have several mothers that did not birth me, that never had children, like Carol Harris or Monica Small. Like they never had children, but I am their child, right? And so I've had many mothers, but the idea of grandmothering, which means that you don't carry the child, but you almost carried the seed of that child in you. When I gave birth to my child, I realized that I had her seed in me and her children's seeds came with her, right? So when they were born and when she was pregnant with them, I was like, oh my God, like my mother had your seeds in her and her mother had our seeds in her. And when they were born, I saw my daughter's face again as a newborn in them. And then I held them and I cried and I was there when they were born. And when they cried, I still felt that same hurt when their mother cried. But there is a freedom that comes with grandmothering, you know, where you don't have as much of the responsibility and you get to spoil that fruit, if you will. And then my daughter and her husband, the first time they went out and I had the newborn baby with me, they FaceTimed me from a grocery store or like a 24-hour market. I was like, that is not a date. Get out of there. They were like, well, Mom, when are we ever going to have time to go to Walgreens or Walmart? And I'm like, go somewhere fun. I got the baby. No. So with grandmothering, you get special passes and you don't get exhausted. With mothering, you get exhausted, but you don't have time to monitor your exhaustion because you have to do it. With grandmothering, you can tap out. You know, you got other partners that can come in, you know, and help you with this wrestling match. And when the kids ask too many questions, just give them sugar and food. Be like, you talking too much, baby, eat this. So I think grandmothering has a special pass. And you get to do things and you get to tell them to keep those secrets. Don't tell your parents because I'm going to let you do this. But if you tell on me, we ain't going to do it again.
Develop that bond with people there. Yes. Well, we're going to continue this conversation when we return and get to the phones as well. Calls are coming in. We want to hear about your experiences with motherhood as well. 313-577-1019 when we continue on the Metro. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, celebrating Mother's Day with you, Mother's Day weekend. We've got 3 moms here with us and phones sharing stories about Mother's Day. I'm not a mom, right? I'm not an expert at this, so I'm going to stop talking right now, and I'm going to move to the phones as we have Ruby, who's a WDET volunteer. Ruby, welcome to the Metro.
Hi there.
Hey.
Thank you, Nick. It's so nice to be here. What a loaded question. You know, what has motherhood done for me? How long do I have? No, just kidding. first of all, I have two sons, Will and John. Will is about to turn 33. John is 28. I feel almost like I have learned as much from them raising them as I imparted to them. And we had a really interesting journey because we were all in college together at the same time, 3 different schools. I graduated from Wayne State in 2016. 1 week later, Will graduated from Oakland University, and the following April, John graduated from Michigan State. And it was such a unique support system because we were all living in the same place, and God bless my former husband, who was the only working member of the household at that time. But it was such a profound experience that we all shared together. And I wanted to start with that because it's probably unique. But other than that, the ways that motherhood has affected me, I mean, it shifts your priorities instantly. And suddenly you're not the center of the universe, and you willingly give that up to this little being that you just gave birth to. And never look back to switching that priority. You don't know how strong you are.
Yeah. Ruby, I got another call I got to get to, but I really appreciate that insight, especially that interesting tale, because I think that's what I'm hearing from a lot of the voices that we have with us here. And before we get back to the panel that we have, I want to loop in Anita in Dearborn Heights. Anita, go ahead. You're on the Metro.
Hi, I have a special mother story. I had to wait until I was 38 to become a mother. I only have one child. That child is an intern there with you at WDET.
All right. Well, you know how to raise them. Congratulations.
I do know how to raise them. I also have a stepson who is almost 40 and 2 grandchildren. So I have a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old. So motherhood for both of them is a little bit different. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how motherhood changed over COVID because you had brought that up.
Yeah.
You know, my daughter was big into theater and band and, you know, public speaking and all of these things. And she basically lost out on her junior and senior year of high school. There was nothing. There was no theater. There was no marching band. There was nothing. And I think that what that did for her was made her find another path. You know, she started at Wayne State in musical theater and then switched to broadcast journalism because I think that it swayed her to see that that wasn't the path that she should take. So it makes decisions for you. You know, when she wasn't able to do the theater and do all these live things, she's like, well, you know, I was part of the broadcasting at high school and I really enjoyed it. And I think I'm going to change my major.
Yeah.
So it does have, you know, she also lost her best friend during the pandemic. It wasn't COVID related, but it was because of COVID, you know. So, yeah, it makes them stronger, makes the bond, makes parenting different.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, Anita, I appreciate that insight a lot there, Anita in Dearborn Heights. And it allows me to get into this with you guys here. I want to start with you, Carrie, because considering your kids, again, 2, 5 and 8 years old, I'm sure the pandemic had something to do with your motherhood. How did that perspective change during that?
Yeah, COVID transformed our lives. I mean, it did everyone's, you know, and it's twofold. On the one side, it makes you really reflect on your priorities and just like the future that it holds for my kids. Like, how important is bedtime? You know, if they want an extra popsicle on the porch, like, is that really a big deal in the scheme of things? You know, at the same time, it also made me reflect on kind of that spending time with them and holding space for that, but also being an example for them, and making a decision to run for office. And, you know, that's not an easy thing to do ever, but especially when you have small kids. And a lot of people are like, hey, enjoy this time with them. But I think I felt we were losing voices in government and public roles by parents feeling like, hey, I've got to really embrace all this time. And so it's led me to really focus on leading by example for them. You know, yesterday I took my son to a police memorial service, and no phones, no tablets, no books. Like, he has to be part of that. And we had the best time, and he really enjoyed it. But all of those things came from COVID. I don't know what our life would look like.
Got to jump in real quick. Diane, like 5 seconds. Best piece of advice you have for moms out there. Go.
To realize it's on-the-job training and you won't get it right all the time, but you keep doing the best you can.
You know, I am glad I ended with you, Diane.
Hey.
That's going to do it for this edition of The Metro. Thank you so much, Diane Sanders of WDET, Carrie Budzinski, and Sabrina Nelson. You can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. This is 101.9 WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers out there. Now celebrate it and make that feckless child get up and get you some good dinner.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.